Disclaimer: the information and education material contained herein is meant to promote the general understanding and dialogue of GAN's processing. Such information is not meant or intended to serve as a substitute for a healthcare professional's clinical training, experience, or judgment. For patients and individuals, such information is not to be a substitute for professional medical, therapeutic, or healthcare advice or counseling. For medical issues or concerns, including decisions about medications and other treatments, readers, viewers, listeners should always consult their physician or, in serious cases, seek immediate assistance from emergency personnel. Prescription information, procedures, and use of medical devices information should be undertaken only by properly trained and certified medical personnel. We specifically disclaim any warranties, express or implied, including implied warranties of merchantability or fitness for a particular purpose. Such information is provided, as is, and is believed to be accurate at the time of its publishing, but it is the viewer's job to evaluate the accuracy of any information found in this presentation. Every case presented is of their own experience, applied by themselves for themselves, and it applies to their case only. Every person experiencing health problems should seek professional medical advice and consult their course of treatment with a doctor. The processes of plasma balancing described herein are a natural process which supports the body but does not replace medical advice or therapies one is already subject to.
And thank you very much. Welcome everybody to the Keshe American Knowledge Team meeting of 2024. As we continue on with the new session here, what we've been trying to do is to try and get the 6,000 hours of teaching distilled down into something a little bit more bite-sized. And all of us as knowledge seekers, as mature knowledge seekers, we're always trying to find better ways to describe things. And to the new knowledge seekers, there has to be some kind of bridge between here and there, because this bridge is getting longer and longer and longer from those who don't know what's going on to those who do what's going on. And the reason for that is because we can't stop and wait. The teaching and the learning has to go on. This is the Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute teachings on plasma science. We are embarking on the advanced transmission, the Z-axis dimension. My name is Alexander. I'm from Canada. It is March the 3rd, 2024. This is the Keshe Foundation North America Plasma Education Series. So we have been doing this for several years, and there have been a series of advanced teachings. And with the advanced transmission, we're trying to bring in a new dimension to complement the basic transmission and the intermediate transmission series that we've just covered. And so as we go through this and try and understand how do we overcome this donkey hesitancy and what does it mean exactly? Because if we understand that the donkey travel is the lowest energy state, and as we grapple with this and we discover that rolling is faster than walking, we are still in the lowest energy state. And so in our efforts to even go faster, we struggle with life, and it's very hard. Until, as they say, you get up on the horse, because the horse walking is faster than the man walking, isn't it? But what is the point? And is it point by point, or step by step, or step by cycle? How many steps? How many cycles? How many points? And so as we're trying to go through the books of Meron Keshe, book number 1, where we have the universal order of the creation of matter, and you see, well, here's a big point. The bringing together of matter, dark matter, and antimatter. And then book number 2, the structure of light. Well, there's another point. And in between these 2 points, there's another point. This is a very long point, though. And then, of course, in book number 3, the origin of the universe, well, now we have 2 points. So this is a difficult thing for us to understand, only because we have to stop doing what we have been doing, and reverse the flow and start doing what we need to do. So in other words, unfortunately, for too many of us, we have to unlearn what we've learned. And so we were embarking on the transmutation preparation sessions, which for 6 months until June of 2024, we will be learning how to do these transmutation sessions and adapt. Because adapt is what we need to do, because we have adapted to a system of donkey travel. And so the next session will be March 29th, and that'll be the third session. And of course, that'll be after the major expo in Sanya, China. So you want to date stamp this and understand that as of February the 27th, on Tuesday, there was the 315th One Nation, One Planet, One Race for Justice and World Peace. And, you know, it's a race for justice and world peace. And it's hard to win when you're traveling at the donkey speed, as we're all trying to search for outer space. And we see that, you know, the structure of light is pretty important, because that's how we get to that point on the plasma highway. That plasma highway that goes to that pie in the sky and maybe beyond. And do we really understand that? And is that a realistic goal? Or is the way we're doing it a realistic approach? Because there is a plasma highway, and it goes certainly much faster than we're going. But we're not on that highway. We're on the transmission highway. And is there a difference? And yes, there is. There's a huge difference. So when we're dealing with the physicality, we have to understand that there is an embodiment of the universe. And when we look out there and see the universe, and we see how large it is compared to how small we are, and we say, well, the only way that we can get from here to there is at the speed of light. And so once we get there, we will be going at the fastest rate possible. So we assume that the speed of light is the fastest transmission. But really, is that true? And of course, since we're very small, and if we want to get over there, then, you know, and there is so big and we're so small. And so in order for us to get there, when we have to go at this very, very fast rate, maybe that's the problem. If we're going to go faster, we have to get bigger. Or if we get bigger, does that mean we go faster? So, which is true. But then what is beyond that? So, which is which? Is it faster, or is it bigger, or is it beyond? And so we try and relate this in our physicality to how we're operating in this Earth space landing point. So this is an important point. We see that ships travel on the surface of water, so faster than we do as we're walking, but still pretty slow. And then if we want to go faster, we go into airplanes. And if we want to go still faster, then we go into warplanes. But as we go faster, we have to go bigger, and then faster and higher and above and beyond. And, you know, not even satellites are far enough, because we can go beyond the satellites and go into that in-between space. So we can clearly see that in order to accommodate this faster speed, we have to have a bigger reality. And we know that this reality is huge. So we can see roughly how far we have to go to attain the speed of light. Because that's the reality that we see. And we can only see things when we see the light. But how is the universe created? And so if we understand that the creation of the universe exists from energy, and that energy is within the light, and so that energy always has to be positive. So what is the charge? The charge is the energy in motion. So we have to understand that there's a direction, a flow. And as we've seen on the cover of book number 1, we have these 3 flows come together as one. But then if they came together, they came from somewhere. So that something had to contribute. And if it's here, where is it going to go now? And so if it's going to go somewhere, it has to go. So something's coming, something's going. And so we always have to take things into account in combination. In combination. That's the key. And so we see with the cups of life, when we put in combination components in the cups of life, and we didn't call them the cups of pandemic, although they were demonstrated to the public in the during the pandemic. They represent the inner space, emotional strength that we have that emanates from our core space. And where does it go? To some nebulous point somewhere else. But in the meantime, we have created GANTs, and not just any GANTs, but pretty specific GANTs, which became the radiance manifestation from the cups of life, and it was different for different people. So there was carbon dioxide GANTs and calcium GANTs, zinc GANTs, copper GANTs, water GANTs, amino acid GANTs. And wait a second, these all came from the same cup. So which is it? Well, it's all of them. All the things came together in combination. So we see these relationships, and we see that when we were talking about the two dimensions of transmission, the x-axis and the y-axis, we find that the y-axis dimension affects the x-axis transmission. And so likewise, the x-axis dimension affects the y-axis transmission. And so we get a chance to pinpoint relationships. And so this determines our distance transmission. But in order to understand this donkey travel, we have to base it on the length of a foot. And so we were concerned about whose foot. So, is it a small man's foot? Is it a large man's foot? And if your body is a containment for your soul, maybe the length of the foot is not the only dimension that we can concern ourselves with. And so we see that maybe the distance transmission could be based on a flat foot or a fat foot, because we have other dimensions to take into consideration. And up until now, we've only taken into consideration the x-axis dimension and the y-axis dimension, because that gives us the length and the height. But how do you measure fatness? Well, we can see this limitation because if we are looking at construction materials like lumber, you can't go by the two dimensions where you have the x-axis dimension measures the width and the y-axis dimension measures the height. And we do this in the construction trade. We base them on 2x. And so there's 2x4s, 2x6s, 2x8s. And this is the primary dimension of studs that every home builder needs to build a good home. But how long is it? So we don't have enough information to make a determination when we're doing our home building, right? Because we don't know if it's for the guy who has the small foot or the guy who has the big foot. And, can you build a home just based on these two dimensions? And how big is the doorway? And if you go through that doorway, you may have to duck because you don't have enough information to complete the home. And so that becomes the point of the whole discussion, you see. We have to figure out how do we progress from this point, because all this point does is pinpoints the positioning of the two dimensions. So we need another dimension, And so we add another point. Here we get the chance to connect these 2 points. So we need 2 points to connect one. So you cannot connect without 2. It takes 2 to connect 1. But what happens if you add another one? Well, then you only need to connect 2. So in other words, 1 less than the number of points that you have, because you've already connected the first one, haven't you? So with 3 points, you have 3 connections. Are those 3 dimensions? Or are they 3 connections? Well, we can't really tell, because it still could be 3 points that have 2 dimensions. And then along comes Dino Crespidon, who was a Brazilian mathematic genius, and he worked it out that God is a set of mutually perpendicular lines of force oscillating upon themselves. So by introducing this perpendicularity, we can see how we can go from point to point to point to point, and we've now introduced another axis. So not only do we have an x-axis and a y-axis, but as I say in Canada, now we have a z-axis. But that doesn't define the path, does it? Because we can have different ways of traveling this x-axis, y-axis, and z-axis. And it doesn't say how far or anything else. It really doesn't give us any dimension, and it doesn't give us any perspective, really, except to say that there is a third dimension. And so this forces us, when we have a 4th point and we connect 3, now we can start to see that maybe if we take the bottom 3 points, that is a plane in 1 dimension. And if we take the left 3 points, that's a plane in another dimension. If we take the right 3 points, that's a plane in another dimension. And we're looking at this, and we don't seem to be part of this dimension. But that's another point. What we're trying to do is to figure out that wonderful game of tic-tac-toe, and we talked about this before, because when we look at this, we see that if we go across, that would be the transmission. And if we go up and down, that would be the transmission. And in this case, both of them are O's. So the question becomes is, whose turn is it? And regardless if it's a transmission or transition, then the turn would fall to O. But what about X? What about X? Because if the x-axis is a transmission and the y-axis is a transmission, so that would pinpoint the placement of whose turn it is right in the center. But that isn't whose turn it is. That's where that turn goes. We still don't know about X. So we have the Z-axis transmission. Now we have the X point of view. And interestingly enough, the merging of the x-axis transmission and the y-axis transmission and the z-axis transmission arrives at the same point in the center, the convergence point. But it still doesn't answer the question as whose turn it is. So let's look at what happens if we go and take more into account. And so we look at these dimensions on the x-axis transmission as being part of the 4-diamond set. And then the y-axis transmission as being another part of the 4-diamond set. But now we've introduced the z-axis. And so now we maybe see the 6-diamond set and how all those can converge in the center. We still don't have enough information. So this is the problem with the periodic table of elements, you see, because it's elementary, my dear Watson. Elements are elementary, but life is much more complex. You see, the sum of the parts is greater than the sum of the parts. It's the knowing of the details versus the details of knowing. So when we look at carbon and we see carbon-6, it's a gas. But diamonds are made out of pure carbon. Oh, but they're not carbon-6, they're carbon-8. But they're not elementary. Because the fact that it's pure carbon is not the criteria for being in the periodic table of elements. So we don't have diamonds in the periodic table. Because although the diamonds are composed of an elementary element and only an elementary element, they are not an elementary element. They're a combination of elementary elements. Except that in this case, they are the same elementary element. So the diamonds are a combination of one element, being carbon. And when we look at the amino acid, it is a combination of 4 elements: carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and hydrogen. So those elements are also elementary. But likewise, amino acid is not on the table of elements because it's not elementary. It's a combination. So whether it's a combination of multiple elements or a combination of the same element, it is still not on the table of elements. Only the singular elements are on the table of elements. And why do I bring that subject up? Because that's the terminology that we're trying to understand. So when we first discussed this, we said the x-axis is the transmission field of rotation, and the y-axis is the transition field of polarity. And of course, the z-axis is the transmutation field representing field strength. But in reality, these are all individual dimensions that are representations, part and parcel of transmission. So in other words, if we were to look at in the first case and how we represent the x, y, and z axis, that represents our star formation, the amino acid. But if we look at the x, y, z axis as part of the transmission dimensions, that's more like the diamond. That's more like the purity of the multiple carbon elements of the diamond. And there's a difference. There's a radical difference. Because as these forces come together, the first thing is that there has to be some kind of attraction force. There has to be some kind of common denominator. Because when two forces come together, they create these first two dimensions, the y-axis and the x-axis dimension, because that is the nature of two forces coming together. One force cannot come together. One force is already together. Only two forces can come together at the very least. And then as we start to capture more forces, So we've seen with the x-axis transmission, and we say, okay, well, that's parallel to the ground, and the y-axis transmission, oh yeah, that's perpendicular to the ground. Well, what is the z-axis transmission? Because which ground is that, relating to? And so this becomes part of the fatness, the field capture fatness, bringing together the x-axis dimension, the y-axis dimension, and the z-axis dimension. But we see that there's a difference in position, and what is that difference? So we've been discussing the rolling along anomalies of the x-axis transmission, and we found that we had to roll perpendicular to the ground, but on the ground. And every time we rolled one cycle, that was one rotation. And then we found that if we put these rolling wheels on a car, that we could move. And we found that if we put an input rotation that was perpendicular to the motion, that we can move faster. But the output motion is still aligned with the rotation, you see. The output motion is not aligned with the input rotation. And of course, the car is the containment for your body. And that's not walking, rolling, or flipping. It's just moving along on the ground. So that means in order for it to keep moving, it has to keep rolling. And in order to keep rolling, it has to keep having input rotation. And in order to do something with that constant input rotation, there has to be constant output motion. And so all of this is going on constantly in order for us to change our position. And so as we've analyzed this through, we've seen that this transmission doesn't just go through two dimensions, but it's a two-way street. And this two-way street goes in two directions. And there are more than two sizes, more than two variables, and of course, more than two lanes on each direction. So things are kind of multiplying, doubling up, if you will. And so the problem here is that we see these cycle relationships that where we have the diameter versus the circumference, that relationship is pi. And so when we're discussing cycles, we were discussing wheel cycles. So there's different sizes of wheels, and then there's pedal cycles, and then now we have ball cycles, because it isn't just the diameter versus the circumference of the small wheel and the big wheel, and the answer being pi, which is the same answer. But now we look at this radius versus the surface area of the ball, and it too is related to pi. So these cycle relationships are always constant. And so we have this constant relationship to pi based on the x-axis dimension of the circumference and the y-axis dimension of the diameter and the z-axis dimension of the radius. So now we have to take more into account, and what has changed? Well, the energy is still in motion. We still have a negative and positive charge, and we find that the energy can be flowing or binding. And so how do we decide? And so we have to understand there's no such thing as one and the same energy that constitutes a charge at two adjacent increments of time. So this is the principle of flow. And flow has to follow connection. Oh, didn't we say that was the point? And if we look at the x-axis, which is rolling, or the y-axis, which is rotating around the pole, we look at the z-axis and it is spinning. It is spinning 360 degrees perpendicular to the ground. And so it's the y-axis perpendicular to the ground in different positions. But when you look at the ball, how do you know which position it is? It's just spinning on its z-axis, because whichever way you turn the ball, it's still a ball. And it's moving. So there's a different position. But now it can be spinning along. So when we graph this, and we were looking at the x-axis and the y-axis dimension and how we graph it, we find that the energy is either positive or negative and determined by the flow. But, you know, we still are spinning along according to this dimension. But now we're adding the z-axis dimension, so it's no longer just a rotating wheel. It is now it's a rotating ball. And is it always rotating on the same axis? Well, of course it's not, is it? So regardless of how it's rotating, it is binding energy. And that's what we're doing. We are managing our manifestation and physicality through this self-serving of the binding energy. And somehow we've decided to do that at the expense of others. And if you understand that the others are binding their energy through self-serving work, and yet you are robbing from them, now there's a shortfall. So what do? Do they forget how they got the self-serving binding energy in the first place? Or do they say, well, you robbed from me, I'm going to rob from someone else? Or do they decide to fight you to prevent you from stealing that energy? And maybe, just maybe, they may find out that they can steal your energy. Well, that's a plan that's not working, is it? And yet when we look at the Earth and we see how the Earth is rotating, we know that because we see the sun come up and the sun go down, and we know that it's rotating on its y-axis, which goes through the poles, but we know that the Earth is fat. It isn't flat, it's fat. So we find that this binding energy is coming in, and more is coming in. And it's coming in from all directions, because this is all part of attraction. It's all part of the principles of absorption that gives the Earth the gravitational stability. So the Earth has this gravitational stability through this binding energy transmission that comes from somewhere. So how does the car move? Well, we're preoccupied with frequency, and we find that frequency times the cycles equals time, and frequency times the wavelength equals the distance. But is that frequency on the x-axis transmission or the y-axis transmission? Or now, wait a second, we're introducing the z-axis transmission. And so we still have this difference in position, but now we can say that we weren't driving a flat car and walking on our flat feet, but we had fat feet and a fat car, and we have not flat balls, but round balls, and they are rotating in every direction. And since the energy is coming in, then the energy transmission has to go out to maintain whatever it is that we have. So more has to go out through emission. And that's done through the force fields of repulsion. But this contributes to magnetical stability. So now we have this relationship of magnetical to gravitational. And so we see that if we are repeating these cycles to go from here to there, as in position of car number 1, going to position 1A, so as it goes along, it has to absorb energy and it has to emit energy, because if it didn't do that, by the time car 1 got to position 1A, it would be much bigger, much fatter, and would it be going faster? If it was bigger, would it go faster? Or if it was faster, would it be bigger? So we could say that time and distance is the difference in position, which is good for the x-axis dimension. But what's happened on the y-axis transmission and the z-axis transmission? Well, at least it's keeping the thing going. So let's go to back to our graph. And so if we understand this business of having a point, so the point of the point is determined by a point in the x-axis dimension and a point on the y-axis dimension. So here we have one ball at a certain point, and this ball is moving. So then we have this ball at another point. Well, that point is determined by the x-axis dimension and its interaction with the y-axis dimension. The ball is still moving. And so where is it going? Well, we can determine that by another x-axis point on the x-axis dimension and another y-axis point on the y-axis dimension. And so we can graph this. And so between these points, we make a connection and we say, oh, you know what? The ball is moving because of this connection. But let's say if you're playing with this ball in a game of soccer and you kick the ball, do you see this connection? Or do you just see the ball at one point and then you see the ball at another point and then someone else kicks it to another point and say, wow, you're asking me so many points. But now if we introduce the z-axis dimension and you say, well, wait a second, what's the difference? We're still graphing points, but is it possible that we need to have another graph? Or it's not a matter of needing to have another graph, it's a matter of there is another graph that we have to take into account. We don't know which one it is, but if we look at the same picture and we say, okay, the point of the first ball is at the point of the x-axis dimension interacting with the y-axis dimension, and then it's moving. And it moves to another point, and we determine that by the x-axis dimension and the y-axis dimension. The ball is still moving. And then we see that point where that ball is moving to, it is still pinpointed by the x-axis dimension and the interaction with the y-axis dimension, but not on the same graph, on a different graph. So when you're kicking the ball and the ball goes from one point to another point, do you see the connection? And if you kick it another way, do you see the connection? And is the first connection the same as the second connection? It seems like it, but clearly it's not. It's a different dimension. But it's the same dimension. It's the same z-axis dimension. And it's the same x-axis dimension, the same y-axis dimension. But it's at a different point. So what that means now is that we can build our home, because we now have a new dimension to take into account. And so where we had to just build a home based on the length and the width, and we didn't know how big the door was, because we don't know how big large is. So we need to figure out not only the height and the width, but we also had to figure out the length. And so now we can build the home to suit, and we can be creative as well. And so we have many elements in the periodic table of elements that have come together based on the differences in these dimensions. Because if we didn't have these dimensions, we clearly wouldn't have table of elements. And so when we're playing this game of soccer, yeah, we could roll the ball along the ground, and that would be our x-axis transmission. That's pretty basic. That's an important skill. But then we wanted to learn how to do half volleys. So we had to kick the ball in the bounce. Well, that's the Y transmission skill. But what would happen if we kicked the ball and we put a spin on it? And we would notice that it would bend in its travel. So whether it's going in a straight line on the X, or whether it's going in a bounce on the Y, or whether it's going in a bend on the Z, it's still getting to the same point. So here we are adding more skills, and now we understand the difference between an amateur player and a professional player. A professional player obviously has more skills, and they take more into account. Well, we are professional people too, you see, because we understand that we're undependable, because we're all variable. There's over 8 billion of us, and we have too many variables, and we're living in 3 dimensions. And that 3-dimension living is our earth space embodiment. The earth space is the common denominator. It is far more dependable than we are. In fact, it is so dependable, actually it doesn't even need us, really. You know, and it'd probably be just as happy. But, you know, the earth space is still traveling around in its cycles, and it is a maggrav. And so these cycles are maggrav dependent. And the frequency of the cycles are also maggrav dependent. And so the containment of all the periodic table of elements is maggrav dependent. And it is based on nearness and proximity and the coexistence filtering that filters out the various dimensions, and they become very specific. So this is all part and parcel of the Gans binding, because that is caused by the binding of energy. And if we put an excessive input rotation, as we do in our cars, we can get this extreme offsetting and still maintain this plasma stability, because we're all fans of the man, aren't we? And we want to understand transmission, because the release of the binding energy has to precede the retrieval of the beneficial energy. How does that work? If we need the binding energy to create the binding field, how much binding do we do? So the initial binding of the field has to come together. But if we continue to bind, then we will no longer be that element. We will be a different element. So therefore, if we want to arrive at a plateau, we have to start releasing that binding energy so that we can improve the quality of the transmission. Because to retrieve the beneficial energy, we have to release the binding energy that we don't need, because now the binding energy becomes a limitation. So the binding energy is the initial field capture, but the field release precedes the growth of the field capture. So in other words, the giving has to precede the taking. The emission has to precede the absorption. And motion cannot exist without the coexistence, because emotion is a product of existence. Motion and coexistence reside in both matter states. These matter states are the plasma state and the physical state. So the plasma is the dominant state, and it precedes the physical dominant state. And this is the point. When we look at what happens on this planet and why it doesn't really need us per se, is because this planet hasn't achieved its gravitational field binding through the magnetical positioning of the sun and its relationship with the field binding of the earth. And it started with the elementary element of hydrogen. And from there came the periodic table of elements, which continued the field binding in the 3 dimensions. And some became certain elements, and others continued to do field binding and became other elements. And so the culmination of all of these dimensions comes to a center point. And so the conclusion for this dimension-centric universe is that the conclusion is not man-space-centric, it's probably Earth-space-centric. But what if it's sun-space-centric? Well, we're not conclusive with that discussion yet. But what we do know is that the containment of the Earth is dimension-centric, right? And so the proximity of the energy coming to this Earth is also dimension-centric. So any pinpoint positioning that we're looking at is dimension-centric. But what's the message? Are we concerned with the pinpoint positioning, or is there a message? What is the point of the matter-plasma dimensions? One is feeding and one is feeding back. And it seems that man is feedback dominant. And here we are in the post-November the 11th of 2023, where we do have choices. Well, actually, we don't have a choice. We have to understand that there's an outer space, an inner space, and an earth space. And we have a choice to accept that if we want to achieve that graceful space. So in that choice, we have no choice. But once we have this choice, then we can choose which bountiful space do we want, which transmutation space that we want, because all of them have to do with the inner space of freedom and peace, that graceful space. We've been trying for 527 knowledge seeker workshops in a row to find that greater oneness, not the lonely oneness, the greater oneness, to transcend the limitations of nuclear science. And as such, we put a call out to the top scientists around the world to join the Kesh Plasma research teams. and understand that we are a spaceship institute. And when we say space, we're talking about outer space. This is the Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute teachings on plasma science. So welcome all you beautiful knowledge seekers. There's a world peace treaty and you need to sign it. Sign it with a pen and display it proudly wherever you are. But sign it with meaning and intent. Sign it with your soul. And understand that man is not just cornered in a two-dimensional universe. Man wishes to find heaven through the field transmission of vertical motion with the guidance of forward motion and perpendicular rotation. Yes. And then we see that it's pointlessly searching for the third dimension of truth. Well, the Z-axis dimension carries the transmission message. That's why plasma science needs to continue to be delivered daily in exchange for peace on Earth. And so welcome to the new outer space age. And thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed this trip.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Let's see if anyone wants their money back that they spent going on this trip. We have a very juicy question as from Ike that we've have in the chat here. I'm sure you can spend a day, a week, a month, 5 years going deeper and deeper into this question. But before
Does it
we
have
get,
something to do with this?
what the heck is that?
Yeah, go ahead, carry on.
Okay, is that a UFO of some sort? But before we get to Ike's question, let's see if any of the participants would like to raise a question about what you've just discussed or what you've just shared with us in this idea of giving and taking. If I was out in outer space and someone had left some fields there, do I have to give fields to take that field? Or since it's been freely given, if I ask, is it mine without giving anything? Or if I take one cookie, do I have to replace it with another cookie?
Can you just not ask one question at a time?
Take your choice. I've given you options, let's say.
Well, when three men go to a bar, each man buys the drink for the other guy. But when the women go to a bar, then they want to replace that drink.
So it all depends on which gender you are in the universe?
Well, let's just that's kind of a joke, but it's more a point of view.
Mine
So-
is too. I don't think there's any gender really in the soul level, but go ahead, please.
No, well,
Male and female souls?
it has to do with the giving and the taking and the nearness and proximity and the susceptibility. So if you're passing this field and that field has energy that is abundant, by the nature of that field, because it's in a plasma state, is it's giving. And if there is a common denominator, then the decision to take from that field has already been predetermined, and it's been predetermined by the giver. So there is no direct connection between you and the giver in that regard at that point in time.
So if I put some bird seed on the picnic table in the backyard, let's say, and the birds want to come and take from it, do they have to give me something first to be able to take from that seed?
What an excellent example. Beautiful. That is a terrific answer to your question. Well, what do the birds give you?
Well, maybe I just, after I put the seed in there, I just got in my car and drove away because I had something else to do.
So did your physical presence determine whether or not those birds enjoyed the food that you gave them?
I don't think so. I don't even think the physical seed could be all blown away, but someone will get that energy that I left. But the question is, do they have to give to me first? Do they have to say, oh, thank you? Or do they have to ask permission to take that seed that was freely given and
Back
left
to
in
the
that
question.
position?
Back to the question. What is it that they're giving?
Well, you've raised the question. Maybe you can answer the question as you understand it.
How about if they give you the enjoyment of knowing that you have provided some food for them that would enhance their comfort and joy?
But is that a prerequisite for them taking?
Yeah, of course it is, because it's unconditional. That's how life works. When the sun gives you energy, what is the intention of the sun?
Total giver, not looking for anything in return. Although it does get a confirmation of existence, let's say, but it's a free giver, unconditional giver. That means there's no conditions
Right,
required
right,
for you to take it.
right. But you know, through the prosperity, and let's call the prosperity the manifestation of a healthy body, the manifestation of, shall we say, a high quality, purposeful life. Don't you think that is the reward for the sun in its giving? Do you think the sun does not recognize that as its reward?
Does the sun shine on the good and the evil, as we see written in the holy books? I mean, the fairy tales?
Of course, the sun shines on everybody,
No condition, right?
no condition. Okay, but when you start to put a condition on the acceptance, then that also becomes a problem, because then you say, oh, you know, I don't have enough. Well, if you have excess, then the whole definition of excess is more than enough. So if you have excess, then you cannot argue that and say you don't have enough. Wouldn't that be true?
I didn't follow your line of thinking there, Alex.
If you have more than what you need, that would be an excess.
Mm-hmm.
So an excess is more than enough, because what you need is enough. You don't need more than enough. You just need enough.
Yeah, I
And
think we have to learn to take what we need and not more than we need.
we have to
Like
take it in a timely fashion.
you're going to put it in your pocket for later or something.
Or, you know, there's famine in a certain area on this earth, and people who are able to feed those who are starving will discuss it next week. So we can clearly see that the solution, not only, although the solution could be the correct solution, it's not going to come in a timely fashion, because by the time they make the decision on what the solution is, the problem will disappear, because those hungry people will no longer be hungry. they will be non-existent in that physical state.
Okay, let's, thank you. Let's open it up again to the floor. And let's see if anyone would like to raise a thought, a question, an objection, an issue. I don't see Ike here at the moment. Perhaps we need to wait for him to come back in before you actually address the question.
I have a feeling he's going to address the answer on his recording.
Okay, so we could do that. Let me ask you another question, Alex. Are you under the school of understanding that the more you know about this knowledge, the better the Keshe Foundation systems work for you? In other words, if you're only in an understanding of grade 1, are they less effective than someone who's in grade 10, let's say?
Definitely.
Do you?
Yeah, because you see, it's like anything that you do that has a skill set. So the definition of the skill is to acquire some knowledge and then apply it. So you can only apply it if you have the knowledge. So obviously that's the first thing. So the more knowledge you have, the more you can apply. And you know, when you look at learning, I think you will find that it is very frustrating when you don't know how to do something. And the pleasure comes when you do know how to do something. And the better you do it, the more pleasing it is. So some people, you know, they enjoy the pleasure so much that they don't want to consider anything else. And that's where the limitation comes in. That's where the obstacle comes in. So you say, well, let me put an example like this. And this was a discussion that I had with my father. My father was a professional soccer player. And what's nice about being a professional soccer player is you don't need anything. Everything is provided for you. Money, food, wine, women, song, whatever you want, you got it. And so the question was, is it better to be a small fish in a big pond, or is it better to be a big fish in a small pond? And my dad liked to be the big fish in the small pond. And that really frustrated me.
Is that egocentric?
Yes, of course it is. And, you know, this is one of the problems that we have with professional athletes, you know, because when sports was first being popularized, people played because of the fun. And so there's, you know, millions of people around the world who every Sunday morning get together for a kick around, regardless of their skill level, because they're having fun. But as the professionalism comes in, and then people start to pay for that professionalism because people pay to watch that professionalism. So the more professional, the better the game, the more people watch and the more people pay. And so the joy of playing the game is substituted for the results and the financial gain that comes along with it. So the skill level of a coach or a manager of a team is to make sure that the player plays for the joy of the game and the pleasure of the fans and not for the money, because you can do anything for money. And obviously, literally anything for money. But, you know, what can you do for pleasure? What can you do not only for your pleasure, but for the pleasure of others? Because when you're playing the professional sports, you have fans. These are the fans of man. So they're your fans. So playing for their pleasure. So it stands to reason that the more pleasurable they are, or the more pleasure that they derive, then the more that you give, the more they like you. And in return, the more they give to you. But they don't give it to you. There's an intermediary, and that is the management of the team. So they give to you. So you are getting it from the fans, but it's indirect. But it doesn't matter. And so some players say, well, you know, all I wanted was the money, and I got the money. I don't have to give anymore. And you find that they're very unhappy because they've missed the point. They've missed the purpose in their life. They have missed the whole essence of what it is. Because, you know, name a famous star, say like Maradona. There are millions of people who are playing every Sunday morning on the field in their shorts and poor equipment, and it doesn't matter what it is. Doesn't even matter if the field is bumpy or it's not the best. And they are vicariously living as if they're Maradona, because whatever they're doing is full of bountiful skill. And then they go and watch the games and compare their skill to the skill of the professionals. And they ride the shoulders of these professionals and enjoy that game as if they themselves were playing. So they are using the player as a carrier for their own joy. They're riding on the player. The player
Right. My
is the
team,
transmission and the
my
fan
player,
message. Yes,
that's
go ahead.
my man.
Yeah. But they're riding on him. Okay. So it doesn't, that fan doesn't even have to be in the stadium. Doesn't have to watch at the stadium. He can watch on TV. He can watch on a recording. He can watch a month later. And he can rewatch. And that's what we do with the Kesh Foundation. We don't understand, and it gets frustrating. So we have to repeat and repeat and repeat until we get it. Because every time we repeat is another cycle, and it gets us closer to our destination. And sometimes we don't see any progress until we come to this threshold. And then suddenly we cross that threshold. And that threshold is our limitation in our knowledge and our limitation in the interpretation of our knowledge. Because what we're looking for is in the success of our skill set. And that is the physical feedback that we're seeking. And so we become feedback dominant. Whereas if we were to relax and trust our skill and forget about our performance and look forward to the pleasure that is non-tangible, and the skill set that you have and the interpretation of that skill set that is non-tangible, and then you ride on the shoulders of the spirit of Maradona that is non-tangible, and then you will be in heaven. And
Yeah,
yet you'll be
go
just
ahead.
ordinary Joe Muck and Fudge playing on the field on Sunday with a bunch of other people who you may or may not know.
We're
So
still
that,
trying to make the correct mag route after 7 years, aren't we?
yeah, exactly. And this is what I'm really trying to focus in this series, is to understand that we are feedback dominant. And we even get confused. We don't know which feedback we're feeding back to because, you know, all we see is the progress from here to here. But the picture looks the same, but it's clearly not the same. And you say, oh, the guys in the foreground, they're in the small pond. And the guys in the background there, well, they're in the big pond. Well, I don't want to go in the big pond because I want to be the big fish.
Yeah, it does seem that when some of these superstars are not the big cheese anymore that they were in their younger days or at other times where they get injured, they start developing certain psychological conditions because they're not in that spotlight anymore.
So at the
And,
age of 41, which was the age that my dad retired from, his favorite mantra was that he now had one foot in the grave at the age of
yeah,
40.
yeah. Oh, here's Ike coming back in. Yeah, it's almost like people that retire, they've put so much into their job. This is what they've identified with. This has been their whole existence. And then when they're sort of put out to pasture, let's say, don't know what to do with themselves anymore because everything was part of their work or their job in a way, and they seem to lose a connection or something happens to them. And this has been reported, I know. Okay, now that Ike has jumped back in, but let's open it up to the others. Everyone has a microphone. Is there something you'd like to share with us or ask Alex about? We have a very juicy question from Ike, and we're gonna, as I said, we could, Alex could open it up. I'm thinking I used to say 1/1,000,000 of 1%. Now I'm thinking I understand 1/1,000,000th of 1/1,000,000th of a percent. So I'm either going backwards or getting more humble. Anyone? This is why you have been
That's
provided a
how it
mic.
feels like that all the time, that we are still not understanding, but we're making progress.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
So, Ike, what do you think about this graph that I've got on the screen?
I was gonna ask, I can't, wasn't so I just popped out. So what is it all about? Sorry.
Okay, well, if you're looking at the pinpointing of these dimensions, and so the soccer ball is at this pinpoint, but the soccer ball is moving, and if you want to identify where it's moving to, you have to pinpoint another point. And then once you've done that, you have to understand that the ball is still moving. So where's it going? And so you pick another point. But if you take this condition, and it's very similar in that you have 3 points and you have 3 connections to these 3 points, but there's something decidedly different. So when you look at the first 2 points and they're in one graph, and you look at the third point, it's in a different graph, but the ball seems to be moving in a straight line. So the point of this discussion is that we don't take enough into account. We're just assuming that we're in that one relationship. We don't take into account that there's possibly another relationship that affects the first relationship. It just looks like the same relationship. And why I brought that up, if I go back here, is because when you look at the periodic table of elements, each one has its own structure. So each one has its own graph. It has its own pinpoint. But clearly, carbon-6 is not nitrogen-7. It's not oxygen-8. So it's on its own in that element. But when you combine these elements together, you can no longer stay in that dimension. You have to take the others into account. So this is where you're starting to introduce the third dimension. And so when we look at the structure of the star formation, you see the 6, 7, and 8 are the base of the star formation, and the hydrogen would be at the top of the star formation, right? So that would be where you have your 4 points. So on the bottom, you have your carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen. At the top, you have your hydrogen. And these are all connected, but clearly they're not the same. They're all different. So the dimension building principle, where you add a second dimension, you add a second point and then you connect, that connection is a dimension. Then you add a third, you have another connection. And then you add a fourth, and now you have a third dimension. But your point of view could be the 3 on the bottom, the 3 on the left, or the 3 on the right. Or they could be the point of view that you're viewing at right now, which has not been taken into account. So if you were to graph the positions of each of these would be on a different graph. And so when you give all these graphs together and you overlay, and you say, well, I'm measuring the same thing on all of them, but they're clearly not the same, so I get a difference. So the dimension building principle is the same, but the result is different. And it is that difference that gets you into these elements, because each of them is different. But then we had this real problem where carbon as an element is pure carbon, but carbon 8 is a diamond. But it's not carbon 8 as in oxygen 8. It's 8 carbon 6s. So although the diamond is pure carbon, it is not elementary. And so it is not a gas. It is a solid, and it is rock solid. So if you take 8 carbon 6s, what do you have? You have carbon 48. And it's an element of a different kind, isn't it? So when we look at this graph here, okay, well, we have an x-axis and a y-axis, and that pinpoints it. But these balls are round. And they're round in every direction. And then when you graph them, you can clearly see that you can get the same picture, although you introduce another graph. So then you really have to decide, well, I can pinpoint it by x-axis and y-axis dimension, but I have to include the z-axis dimension to know exactly where this pinpoint is, because if you take the points of the third ball and you say the coordinates are, let's say the x-axis is at 3 and the y-axis is at 3, let's say, you're going to be in the wrong point. because you're going to be on the first graph and you're not going to be on the second graph. So if you want to be on the right point and you want to pinpoint that, then you have to say, well, it's on the z-axis dimension and it's on graph 2. So now what you've got, you've still got these dimensions and these points, but now what you're introducing is curvature. And so this curvature becomes extremely important when you look at this. And this was the question I think that you asked me. So if we look at this soccer ball, for instance, and we see that, you know, in the center here, we have, no, that's specifically what I didn't do. Okay, so what where do I have?
You need a 5-sided, right?
Yeah, where is the well, I'm limited on this thing. Okay, I'm gonna have to do this. I see. I'm gonna have to do this by I'm gonna have to do this by pen. Okay. So no, let's take this one here. So this is hexagonal, right?
Yeah.
So this is your stability. And so that becomes gravitational. And there's another one over here, and that one becomes gravitational, and another one here is gravitational, right? So when it's gravitational, it's very stable. Now, this one here, we say this one's magnetic, and it seems to be very stable. But there's a difference. And so we say, well, that difference is, it's a pentagon.
Carolyn, I just muted your mic. Sorry about that, but there was some noise. If you want to open it up later, no problem. Go ahead, Alex, sorry.
Okay, we'll try again. I think I like the whiteboard better. Maybe that's what I should have done. Anyway,
You can still do.
it's okay. It's okay. We're into it now. So what does this pentagon allow us to do that the hexagon didn't? So it allowed us to go from this flatness of these 3 panels. So we have the gravitational panel in the center, the hexagon at the top, and a hexagon to the left. And if we were to have a hexagon in the center, then this ball would be flat. But since we have a pentagon, we have begun a curvature. And so that becomes the relationship. And so we continue that pattern, and that's how we get this spherical structure. But the most important thing is that the pentagon is asymmetric, it's uneven. So when we have this evenness, then we're technically not giving or taking in the physical realm. But we have to give and take to be a maggrav.
Doesn't that pentagon allow the whole structure to be connected? If you, I mean, the pentagon, if you had tried to put in a hexagon there, you couldn't connect the whole structure together.
Well, you could connect it, but it would be flat.
I think it would be overlapping.
No,
This
no.
one fits
If
in
you look at
just right.
if you look at the nature of graphene, it's a series of hexagons, and graphene is carbon, and carbon is 6. So, you know, you've got your I do not have, that's what I'm missing. I'm missing my stuff here. So each point, so there's a point and there's a point, right? So there's 6 points. So each of these points is carbon 6. So 6 carbon 6s would be 36. And then if you have this pentagon, and if each point is still carbon, and that's a connection here, because that's another hexagon back there, right? Another hexagon there and another hexagon. So this pentagon here is missing a carbon, which means if we just look at the pentagon as itself, it has 5 carbon 6s, so that would be 30. Whereas the hexagon is 36. And so if you add those two together, that's 66. But that doesn't give you the ball. That only gives you the relationship between the maggrav, the magnetical gravitational relationship of the pentagon and the hexagon. But it's this feature that allows the curvature, so the curvature will continue. And so as it continues around, you will find that you will continue to get a bunch of these hexagons, and they will be interlaced with a bunch of pentagons. And so it's the relationship between the even hexagons and the uneven pentagons that allows for this curvature. And so you get this spherical structure. And that spherical structure gives you your physical spherical field in physicality. So what we need to understand that we can maintain this spherical field in a plasma state which is not physical. And the reason that is the case is because this structure that you're seeing here remains. The forces that create this structure remain. But in order to maintain this structure, you have to understand that there is constantly energy coming in and energy flowing out. So that energy is constant. So if we take the whole ball, energy is coming in, right? And at the same time, energy is going out. It has to. Even if the ball is not moving, you have movement on one dimension and you have movement on another dimension. So therefore, we have to understand that energy is always in motion and motion is always in motion. Motion never stops because it can't. In order to maintain its position, and if that position is fixed, then it has to give and take. So the sun is also giving and taking. The sun is not just an unconditional giver. It's through its unconditional giving, it gets what it needs to continue to be an unconditional giver. It's the moment when you decide, I'm going to be a conditional giver, that you put a limitation. It's the moment when you decide that you decide. Which means that you and only you decide. That's the limitation. If you understand that your position has to accommodate what others have decided, and the better that you accommodate that, the better that you can coexist. I don't think that's the nature of Ike's question, I think it was more of a mathematical question. Ike, are you there?
Yes, he is.
Yeah, I think it's more mathematical, like you say. But it's interesting. You mentioned the Pentagon. It's not stable, but the hexagon is stable. So
Right.
with stability, you attribute that to gravitational. How so?
Well, because when our relationship with the Earth, you would have to agree that the Earth is gravitational and we're magnetical. Would you not agree with that?
Yes, I do. So then, in that case, if we are in a different dimension, if we are in a different universe, how would we know that would be magnetical, or does it have to be when we have the inertia, it becomes more gravitational?
Right.
Okay.
Our physicality becomes gravitational. So our physicality is at the lowest energy level. Does not mean that we are not participating with higher energy levels. You can sit there and do nothing, but you have 73 trillion cells in your body who have to do something to maintain that position of nothing. And if you're a professional athlete, those 70 trillion cells still have to do the same thing. That doesn't change. Only thing that changes is the kind of physical response that you're giving. So we see that not as a response, but we see that as a determination. So I am going to break the world record. How about, why don't you do the things that it takes to be a professional, to be an elite athlete, and then allow your soul to take all of that into account because you're incapable. You know, if you look at, you know, how many people you engage with and that it's less than 100, less than 1,000. How many orders of magnitude is that? Less than 70 trillion. And so you have to manage that at the same time that you're engaging, you know, another 10 people. So instead of saying, well, I'm going to manage all of my cells, and I'm going to manage the interaction that I have with you, who also has 70 trillion cells to manage. So now, I'm going to take my 70 trillion and manage your 70 trillion. Okay, so now I have to manage 140 trillion cells. And you're thinking, boy, is that ever stupid? You know, you've just doubled your workload. So how about I make it easy for you to manage your 70 trillion so I don't have to? Well, the thing is that those 70 trillion cells have an energy. And so if I diminish you, in other words, if I take responsibility for your 70 trillion cells and I do a really bad job, my reward will be I will get all your energy. And unfortunately, that is true. However, the energy that I get is your meager offering, when right beside it, I have a gold mine. It's called the sun. And the sun gives me all the energy that I need. So if I get all the energy that I need, then I don't need your energy. Why would I want your energy? You know, what is wrong? Why can't I be a little fish in a big pond? What's wrong with that? Because to be a little fish in a big pond, I will have all the energy. Look at all the energy in the big pond, and I only need a little bit. How cool is that? Why do I need to be the big fish in the small pond? Well, who wants to go into a small pond? Well, it has to do with safety. And this planet is the way it is right now is not safe because we have too many self-serving people. So the people that we're talking about are physically feedback dominant. And clearly, the reason we're magnetical is because we're unstable. You look at the earth, it's very stable. That's why we came to the earth. Imagine if we were stable. How would you like it? Then the earth would come to you. Well, that wouldn't work, would it? You'd kind of get crushed. So the logic says the earth is gravitational, you're magnetical. Now, if you want to go someplace else, that other place you're going to is also going to be gravitational. And if it's gravitational, has more energy. It may be at a lower energy state, but it has more energy because it's gravitational. It's more dense. So that is to say that a diamond is carbon 8, but it's 8 carbon 6s. So the mass is 48, whereas the carbon mass is 6. All things in combination.
Alex, can you draw carbon 8?
Sure. Let's just we're just going to have to move a few things around here, and so we're going to have to maybe move that around there, and maybe move that around there.
Conventionally, carbon is always the connector, right?
Repeat that, please.
I said, the chemistry tells us that carbon is the connector.
Yes.
If you look at the chemical formulas, it's always carbon connecting to a next carbon.
Right.
So when you say carbon 8, what is the structure like?
It's all carbon. It's all carbon.
Isn't that stable?
It's rock solid. Very stable. That's why you use diamonds to grind down concrete.
Interesting.
Okay, we have about 15 minutes or so. We're approaching 5 hours. So we can go back and see if there's anything else in Ike's question. Carolyn, you had your mic open. Was that inadvertently?
Totally inadvertent. Thank you.
No problem at all. Ike, you've also put in here something about the video that I shared. Which link to the video you shared at the mosque? There was no video. It was just a few still shots.
Okay, yes, I get it.
Pictures that I took. Okay. And Alenka has addressed Erm's dream. Let's see what she said about that. It's in the chat here from Alenka. I think that Ermgard's dream also means sending the fields to Gaza will also result in ending the physical blockage. Erm, if you're here, I don't know if that'll give you any clues of anything, but this is Alenka's interpretation. Thank you, Alenka. Anything more you wanted to add, Alenka? If you're still with us, I know people do drift in and out. I don't see her here at the moment. I want to save at least 7 minutes for becoming a volunteer. The Brazilian video that Alex voiced over in the beginning, and then Mr. Kesh concluded it. And he did thank everyone that is going into those systems. Alex brought up the transmutation sessions, but this is how the system has been developed in a way, and helping the doctors to understand more. So becoming a volunteer in the sessions in a way is also helping to develop the system. So we thank you all that you've been there, and or others who seem to have connected on the soul level as well to these systems without actually being in the session.
May I just ask Ike one more time? Did I answer, or did I improve my answer to your question?
Yes, it went into another dimension that is actually more explained, but still the question Mr. Cash was answering was the structure. Understand that the question was alluding to 840 having a physical structure, but he mentioned that it's a field condition, but still there has to be some kind of containment to it. So structurally, if we envision carbon as a connector, how would that shape form? But then the confusion is like, there's no shape. It's just a condition. But the condition has a containment. So how is it possible that it's a containment, but physically we can't know? There has to be a boundary. That's why it's a containment. But how is the shape supposed to be? That's where I'm a little bit trying to understand the knowledge on that.
Okay, so let's just jump one more spot, and we'll do this very quickly. It all depends on what you're interacting with. So you have a periodic table of elements. All of those elements follow the same rules, but you end up with a different product. And if I don't have the chart in front of me, but if you look at the crystalline structure of each of the elements, you will find that the crystalline structure is different in each of them. Now, there are similarities in certain of them, and this plays a big part. And you will notice that those who have a hexagonal structure are all similar and will work together. And those who have say a rhombic structure, they would have a similarity. So the skill in designing is, how to interpret these geometric structures. But the problem really is that what these geometric structures provide for you is an affinity, a common denominator. They do not tell you what the structure is, because it isn't like building blocks. It isn't like taking hexagons and pentagons and putting them together. It is taking fields and mixing them together like a cube of sugar in a warm cup of tea. So it's no longer a cube of sugar, but it's still sugar. And that's what you have to understand, that sugar is still in the tea. And so although you can put the sugar cube in the tea and you can dissolve it in there, you can, by reverse process, eliminate the tea and be left with the sugar. It won't necessarily be in a cube form, because that is a physical manifestation, comes about through compression. But the sugar will still be there, and the elemental form of the sugar will also still be there. And the elemental form of sugar is in a pentagon shape. And because it's in a pentagon, it means it's asymmetric. And so it has a high susceptibility to give and take its energy, but it has a unique way of doing that. The pentagon can retain its pentagon shape, but that doesn't mean it has, as you say, 5 points and 5 connections. It could have 5 points and 4 connections. It could have it could have 5 points and 3 connections. Please forgive me, Mark. I just I need to show this. What I'm saying here is if we take this pentagon here, and although it has 5 points, let's say it only has 3 sides. And then if I were to take this line here and say that is the polar line, and clearly, if I were to flip this pentagon along this polar structure, and if this pentagon had 5 points and 5 sides, if I were to flip it along this polar axis, it would still be the same. But if I removed 2 of these sides and then I flipped it, then this leg here that's on the right would end up being on the left. And the gap that's on the left would be on the right. You have just created a lock and key, a gate. And this is the nature of sugar. It can give and take energy, and in doing so, it has to be positive and negative. Well, the positive is the giving and the negative is the taking. So it does this through pole flipping. And this is ongoing constantly. And it's doing it at such a fast rate that it maintains its stability. So you can give and take that energy. And that's what we do when we eat. That's a physiological, biological thing. But if we could do that using the cosmic rays, then we don't have to depend on the physicality of the sugar. We don't have to depend on the physicality of the digestion. We just have to depend on the absorption and emission of the energy that we need to sustain our MAGRAV condition. And so then we do have choices. We can stay in the physicality or we can stay in the plasma reality. But I think what we, from a personal standpoint, I'm thinking more and more every day that the physical reality is a special gift to humanity. And too many have chosen to abuse that and have forgotten the nature of the universal energy exchange. So I hope that answers it better, Ike, and I really thank you for your question.
Yes, it does. And then plasma is mostly give and take, so it's dynamic.
Oh, yes. You got it, Pontiac. That's the way. You got it.
Thank you, Alex.
My pleasure, Ike. Thank you again. And thanks, Mark, for allowing me to carry on with this. And thanks, everybody, for allowing me to continue to present every week. Just to say that please remember that February of 2024 has been a very historic month. And please remember that you were there. And you'll be talking about it 100 years from now.